one system for our traditional broadcasters and a separate system for online broadcasters simply doesn't work. This outdated regulatory framework is not only unfair for our Canadian businesses, it threatens Canadian jobs, and it undermines our ability to tell our own Canadian story. C'est une question d'équité. Our government believes that everyone who benefits from the system should contribute to it fairly. This legislation will provide stronger financing mechanism and give more preeminence to what is produced in Canada in English, in French, and Indigenous languages. It will also encourage better representation at all levels of production for racialized Canadians, for women, and for equity-seeking groups. In a more practical manner, our bill proposes the implementation of a modern, flexible regulatory framework for the CRTC to apply fair rules to all broadcasters and make sure it has the necessary tools to do its job effectively. We will also go a step further to instruct the CRTC on how to use these new tools. This will happen once the bill receives royal assent. Our approach is balanced and includes strong guardrails. Let me be clear. Under this approach, user-generated content, news content, and video games will not be regulated. Furthermore, only broadcasters that have a significant impact in Canada will be subject to this regulation. We have adopted a phased approach with this targeted legislation. Other measures are therefore in the works, and we will continue to support Canadian broadcasting, creators, and producers. This legislation is about our cultural sovereignty. It's about investment and jobs. It's about equity. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Yes, thank you, Minister. And I apologize in advance if my questions appear to be a bit simple. What happened to the idea of a tax? The panel that reported back in January of this year recommended that Netflix and other companies should collect local taxes and then distribute them to the government. What happened to that idea?
Thank you, David, for the question. There were a number of very interesting elements in the Yale report, and I think one could argue, and I am arguing that, one of the cornerstone of the Yale report is the fact that online broadcasters, web giants, if you prefer, the Netflix and Spotify and Apple Music and Amazon Prime of this world need to be brought under Canadian regulations, and that's exactly what we are doing. Now, as you are well aware, I am the Minister of Heritage. I am not the Minister of Finance. I will, however, I would like to reiterate what was in the speech from the throne regarding this particular aspect. And I quote, "In the long term, the government will focus on targeted investments to strengthen the middle class, build resiliency, and generate growth. The government will also identify additional ways to tax extreme wealth inequality, including by concluding work to limit the stock options deduction for wealthy individuals at large, establish corporations, and addressing corporate tax avoidance by digital giants." So I think the speech from the throne was pretty clear on that. I'm not pretending that the bill we're tabling this morning answers everything that was in the Yale report, but I think we're going after a very substantial element of the Yale report today.
But secondly, just to seek clarification, would the idea moving forward on tax be eventually to oblige these companies to collect taxes, or are you looking at some other form of direct tax on the activities of these companies in Canada?
I mean, on taxation issues, I would really have to direct you to my colleague, the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister Freeland, who will be in a better position than I am to answer those specific taxation questions.
Thank you. Next question. La prochaine question is from Ryan Tumilty from the National Post. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Yeah, good afternoon, sir. I'm wondering to start with, if you're concerned at all that imposing requirements that these streaming giants pay for Canadian content will mean that that cost gets added on to consumers, that people will have to pay more for their Netflix or their Disney Plus subscriptions.
Hi, Ryan. No, I'm not. we're not asking these companies to do things that they're not already doing. They are investing in Canada. What we're doing is we're putting a regulatory framework on how those investments should be made in light of things we're already asking from Canadian broadcasters. So we're not asking them to do things they aren't already doing. And if you look at the example of Europe, who in many cases, many European countries have had in place similar legislations since 2018. We haven't seen an increase in cost for consumers because of the imposition of such regulations.
We will now take 3 questions in the room.
You're asking for these companies like web online streaming services to contribute. And this is not taxes now, we've heard from your previous statement. So in what way will this legislation have international web streaming services that many Canadians are watching now contribute to either the Canadian economy or Canadian content? Can you clarify that? Does this mean contribute in terms of content, contribute in terms of the television fund, in terms of funding projects in Canada? It seems very unclear as to what that, you're seeking contribution from these companies, but in what way are they contributing, if not taxes and fees?
What we're asking them to do, we're asking these large and wealthy companies to invest in Canadian stories, in Canadian music, in Canadian artists, in the same way Canadian companies like Bell, like CBC, like Chorus, like so many others already have regulatory spending obligations in Canada. And these companies are investing, but right now we're putting a framework around those investments so that it's not on a voluntary basis whether or not they want to invest in Canadian stories, in Francophone stories, in Indigenous stories. In terms of exactly how this will happen, we will be asking the CRTC to hold hearings and to determine the exact mechanisms by which you were asking about funds in your question. So we will be asking the CRTC to determine the exact ways this will take place.
So you don't know, there won't be quotas? Like, for example, there's a quota for Canadian content on radio stations. Will that similar quota be levied on international web streaming services or foreign web streaming services here in Canada? And I understand there's also, just to talk about content, that definition of what Canadian content is changing within this legislation. Perhaps you could expand on what that will mean for people that are producing this content.
Right now, investment or French and English content is generally 25 to 45% of a broadcaster's revenue in that specific market. So depending on their size. So we can therefore expect similar obligations from streamers. As I said earlier in my presentation, and this is an estimate, but we anticipate that this will mean close to $1 billion of additional revenues in the Canadian cultural ecosystems. In terms of the definition, I mean, we will be asking the CRTC to look at this. This is not something that we're doing in the bill, but we will be asking the CRTC to look into this.
Go ahead.
Hi. You just mentioned that the CRTC is going to be looking at whether there's going to be a fund, the definitions, things like that. So if the CRTC is going to be asked to do a lot of the heavy lifting for figuring out exactly what's going to happen, do you have an estimate for when this system is actually going to be put in place?
Sorry, I missed your name.
Sorry, Mia Rabson from the Canadian Press.
Okay. Hi, Mia. Well, I mean, the faster the bill is adopted, the faster this regulation can come into force. I, as minister, I can instruct the CRTC to do things in a certain amount of time. So we will be asking them once the bill is approved, we will be issuing a directive to the CRTC, an order in council, and we will be asking them to hold hearings and to do everything in a matter of roughly 9 months. So we are going as fast as we can. I mean, this is, we haven't reformed the Broadcasting Act since 1991. So it takes time to do it properly, but we don't want to take too much time because we know there's an emergency to act quickly. So we are trying to find this right balance of doing it right and doing it as fast as we can at the same time.
And I also understand that there's not really a lot of talk of what penalties will be if there's violations of the new regulations of the new act. Is there going to be monetary penalties, other kinds of penalties? Are those built in, or what will that entail?
Oh yes, that's specified in the bill. There will be monetary penalties in a case of non-compliance. Absolutely. We could provide you with I have it somewhere here, but yes, we have a pretty good idea.
Yeah, hi there, sir. The Yale report also included some recommendations around CBC, including moving the broadcaster to an ad-free model. I'm wondering if your government's rejecting that suggestion, or if there might be movement on that at some point in the future.
Thank you for the question. There are a number of things that we're not addressing today that were in the Yale report. We are working on other elements of changes, of modernization to the Canadian ecosystems, but these elements will come further down the road. I have said many times in the recent weeks and months that we wanted to look at the issue of another category of web giants, not the same one we're talking about today, but Facebook and Google and their impact on the Canadian media ecosystem. We are working on tabling a bill to tackle that issue very, very soon. In the last few weeks, I've been in touch with my French counterpart, Australian counterpart. I was talking last week to the Australian regulator. As we know, Australia and France are moving ahead with legislation and regulation on this front. So there are other elements of the Yale report that we are working on, but these will come further.